let's introduce this extended producer responsibility and webinar, and it's to help all of us, I guess, get our heads around the regulations, what we need to do. And the reason Plus Packaging are doing this is because sometimes when it comes to this kind of thing, it can be just a case of, well, it's compliance, it's another load of forms, it's something we've got to do, let's carry on. And we want to just take that a little bit further. So when we discuss the EPR as a company and our reaction to it, if you like, it's more than just let's comply, let's move on. We actually wanted to, on behalf of our customers and potential customers, report accurately and on time, make sure that we made it very simple for our customers to get what they need to do done. And a little bit more than that as well, we decided that we also wanted to facilitate, make sure that it was easy for our customers to work out what they needed to do straight away, and make it simple for them. Because let's face it, when it comes to a government release like this, there's often a lot of confusion and myth. We saw it a lot with the plastic tax too, where people were saying, "Oh, I thought we need to do this, I thought we need to do that," which wasn't true, and a lot of unnecessary work. So the idea of this is that you can find the simplest and quickest and most effective way possible to do exactly what you need to do on extended producer responsibility, and to give you that knowledge just so that makes life very easy for you. And the best possible way of doing that is via Andrew McHale of Wastepack, who's doing this webinar for us today. We're very grateful for that. And so listen up, and hopefully at the end of this, there'll be questions and answers as well. But at the end of this, you will know exactly what your own obligations are, if any, and exactly if there are obligations, it's quite likely there are, by the way, and exactly what to do about that. And of course, if you're buying from Plus Packaging, and you'll know that you'll be able to get all the weights and everything you need from us. So without any more of that, Andrew McHale's questions and answers. Sorry, at the end of Andrew's talking, there is a question and answer box. Fire your questions into that as we go through. I don't think you'll be able to unmute, so that's the best place for the questions. And we'll get some of those answered at the end of the call. We will finish at 10. So if we don't get to them all, we'll be following up with frequently asked questions, and anything that isn't in there, we'll find answers to and get those sent to you as well. We'll also give you direct contact to Andrew and Wastepack, who he represents. So Andrew, thank you very much for this. Over to you.
That's all right, thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen just for my presentation, if you just bear with me. There we go. So hopefully you can all see that. Fantastic. So yeah, extended producer responsibility. I think for a lot of people, this is a case of, you know, what is this all about? Is this yet another source of torment from the government to make my life more difficult? And yes, to some extent. So we're just going to look quickly through the agenda that we'll cover over the next 45 minutes. So we're going to look at just the general overview recap of what EPR, extended producer responsibility, is, and why you might be obligated under it. Look at the obligation types and what the requirements are. What is the registration process if you are obligated, and then we'll also look at the general timeline of things as well, and what you need to look out for in the future. And then for the last little bit, we'll look at our questions and answers. So just as a recap of the situation as it is, so extended producer responsibility is intended to replace the packaging waste regulations. So you may have some familiarity with those. They've been around for about 25 years or more, I think, at this point. So you may have some knowledge of those. But EPR is intended to be sort of the next step. I mean, in some respects, somewhat of a quantum leap forward, with a more integrated and more complicated approach that streamlines and funds doorstep collection of household waste, and then over time requires obligated producers to provide more granular packaging data. So that data includes a range or criteria not previously reported, like whether it's household or non-household packaging, whether it's reusable or not, whether it's a type that could end up in a street bin or to drinks container, and in the future it's likely to consider things like the recyclability of the packaging material, with less recyclable materials attracting financial penalties. So as you're saying there, it's a policy tool. It requires packaging producers to be responsible for the full net cost of managing the packaging they place on the UK market at the end of its life. So I mentioned the packaging waste regulations before. If you're familiar with those in any way, you will know that with the packaging waste regulations, a given item of packaging may have up to 4 different entities partially responsible for it. So there's the raw material manufacturer, the converter, the packer filler, and then the supplier of that packaging to the end user, referred to as the seller. Under EPR, there's a switch to that. Instead of having multiple entities responsible for a given item of packaging, instead it's what they called a single point of compliance. So we have a item of packaging, who's responsible for that? So the government first announced this intention to introduce EPR back in 2018. There's been a number of consultations on the various points about it. And indeed, there is another consultation currently open about EPR. And it's definitely worthwhile looking into that if you have a dog in the race, as they say, and look at whether you can have a contribution to that. 2023 is the first reporting year under EPR. So it's intended, as I mentioned at the outset, to replace the packaging waste regulations. However, due to entirely foreseeable problems, the full implementation of EPR has been delayed. So whereas the intention was for 2023 to be the final submission year for the packaging waste regulations, referring to packaging handled in 2022, because of the delays to the full implementation of extended producer responsibility. Not only is the reporting element of EPR in force, but the reporting element and financing element of packaging waste regulations remains in force. So if you have an obligation to report under the packaging waste regulations, that will continue into 2024. And in theory, the 2024 packaging waste regulation submission will be the final one that you're obligated for. So you'll be, if you have an obligation under both, you'll be reporting under both simultaneously. So as we mentioned there, under the packaging waste regulations, the responsibility for financing was spread across the packaging chain. That's no longer the case under EPR once it's fully implemented. Also under EPR, they introduced a lower threshold as well for participation. So whereas under the packaging waste regulations, participation began at a £2 million turnover and simultaneously handling 50 tons of packaging, that same threshold remains for EPR, but that gives you status as a large producer. Below that, so where there's a between 1 and 2 million turnover and between 25 and 50 tons of packaging handled, that makes you a small producer. So that brings in a whole new range of companies that were not previously obligated to report any data whatsoever, or indeed record any data whatsoever. So that certainly will present a challenge for some smaller companies where it's not been something that's ever been on their radar, basically. One of the ironies or challenges of this new regime is that the responsibility to report or record data and then report and register as a small producer will come into force in January 2024. And it's really not clear how those smaller companies will be made aware of this, because the government is certainly not spending any money on it. The Environment Agency isn't. And so it's not clear, beyond compliance schemes such as ourselves, it's not clear who is really trying to contact these companies and inform them that they do have a legal obligation and liability. So with companies such as Plus Packaging actually engaging with customers in this respect, it will help to just raise awareness of it. But it is worth noting that this may well be for many companies just an entirely new thing that they've no familiarity with whatsoever. There's also the new financing element. So you may perhaps have heard in the press about EPR being delayed, and it's been reported as principally it's the financing element that has been delayed. As I said, the reporting requirement still remains in place. So for companies that are obligated under the packaging waste regulations, do bear in mind you still do need to report. The financing element was going to be quite a sea change as well. So the purpose being to introduce waste management fees to cover the costs of local authority waste collections, so the curbside collections. The scheme administrator, who would oversee that element of it, so in terms of setting fees and administering those funds, has yet to be appointed. In fact, has yet to be identified. So we don't even know who that will be. It's likely to, well, it's going to have to be a public body. So it may end up just being a government department. But until that entity is established, we don't know what, even in theory, that the costs associated with that will be. As I said, there's more detailed reporting requirements associated with EPR, including looking at nation data, which I'll mention later on, and also something which some smaller companies have relied on under the packaging waste regulations is a system called the allocation method, which is a really simplified method for very small companies to calculate the packaging data. That's been was not even withdrawn. There's no facility for that under EPR. So companies that are come within the ambit of EPR will have to calculate their packaging. In effect, they're going to have to look at every element of it and assess the weights and record that and report as necessary. So you need to comply with EPR if the following apply. So you're an individual business, subsidiary or group, you have an annual turnover of £1 million or more, you're responsible for over 25 tons of packaging in a calendar year, and you carry out any of the 7 packaging activities, which I'll go on to explain. Of course, we're talking about packaging. A sensible question is, what is packaging? These are the sort of philosophical questions that fill my day. So the definition of packaging is products made of any materials which are used for containment, protection, handling, delivery, and presentation of goods from the producer to the user or the consumer. So just because something looks like packaging, it isn't necessarily packaging, because it depends on whether it's carrying goods or not. A bit of useless trivia, which I always drag out because I find it sort of bizarre, is that things like cash bags are not considered to be packaging, even though it's a small plastic bag. It's not packaging, even though it does provide those kind of protection, handling functions. Cash is not considered goods, so therefore it's not packaging. So generally speaking, you're talking about things like boxes, bags, bottles, wrap, film, corners, pallets, pallet wrap, anything like that, which is used to present, handle, and protect goods. As I mentioned, under EPR, there are a number of packaging activities. So these are quite radically different from the activities that are identified under the packaging waste regulations. So rather than looking at your part of a packaging chain, as I said, you're looking at a single point of compliance. So the point is to, under the various definitions of these activities, we'll briefly look at the definitions here, and then we'll look at more detail in a second. Is to look at the definitions, consider various items of packaging that you're using. Are we responsible for that? So, for example, there's packaging that's supplied under your brand, which makes you a brand owner, where you're applying or pack filling unbranded packaging, so you're a packer filler. where you're importing packaging, where you are supplying empty packaging to other companies, specifically companies that fall below the large producer threshold. That would make you a distributor. Where you are hiring or loaning out packaging, that's service provider activity. Where you're supplying packaging through an online marketplace, which you own, that would make you an OMP, online marketplace operator. Or you're supplying packaging to a consumer. So this is the seller nation data reporting. Now, of course, a business may undertake more than one of these activities. You may be, in some respects, a brand owner because you're selling packaged goods under your brand. At the same time, you might be shipping those goods out using unbranded packaging that you apply, so you'd also be a packer filler. But you're a brand owner of specific items of packaging and a packer filler of entirely different items of packaging. So when they talk about EPR and a single point of compliance, that's what they're talking about. It's not that only one person is responsible for all of the packaging. It doesn't mean you're only responsible for one activity. It means that for a given item of packaging, only one entity is responsible, and you have to assess whether it's you. So we'll just look a little more detail at the different packaging activities. So first of all, brand owner. So this is where you're supplying packaged goods to the UK market under your brand. So that includes if you pay or license another company to produce, pack, or import goods under your brand. Of course, some packaging will have more than one brand on it. So if the packaging carries more than one brand, the producer who makes the supply is obligated. So for example, if a crisp manufacturer would be the brand owner, they would be obligated for its branded crisp packets, even if the packaging also carried the brand of another product. So if we take a child's toy as an example, think about a Lego toy. So Lego has Lego branding on it. So Lego is the brand owner of the packaging around that toy. Of course, Lego licenses other brands. So it could have, I don't know, Indiana Jones, it could have Star Wars or anything on that packaging too, but it's not making Disney responsible for that packaging because it's got Lego, because it's got Star Wars on it. It's a Lego branded product. They're making the supply. Lego is responsible as the brand owner. You also can have a situation where you've got multiple brands inside a single sales unit. So if you have multiple branded items in the same final sales unit, so a hamper is a good example of that, then it's the obligation sits with each brand within the sales unit and with the brand owner of the final sales unit for any packaging added. So if you've got a gift hamper with multiple branded goods inside, each brand owner of those goods is responsible for that branded packaging. The supplier of the hamper would be responsible for the hamper itself, not the branded packaging on the goods within. So that's brand owner. We also then have packer filler. So packer filler is where you're applying unbranded packaging to goods for onward supply. So that would be if you are putting putting products into unbranded packaging for yourself or for someone else. So for example, if you are packing goods for another company and you're packing their branded products into their branded packaging that they've supplied to you, well, they will be responsible for that as the brand owner. However, when you then pack dozens and dozens of those items onto plain card trays, put them onto a pallet, put layer pads in, multiple layers, put pallet corners on, put pallet wrap around it to stabilize it, you will be responsible not for the branded packaging, but for the unbranded packaging that you've used to secure those branded goods for onward supply. Another activity under EPR is importer. So importer is a little more complicated than some of the others because it's comprised of perhaps multiple inputs. So one of the main areas of importer responsibility is if you are importing packaging and then discarding it. So of course, why would you import packaging and then throwing it away? So typically you're talking about importing packaging around raw materials or importing packaging around goods that you're then going to sell on. In order to sell the goods on, you might remove some of that packaging. If you've imported that discarded, removed packaging will be reported under the importer activity. Of course, you might not discard it. You might reuse some of that packaging. You might recycle that packaging. It would still be reported under the importer activity. What else would we report under there? Well, if you're importing branded goods where there's no UK brand owner, that would also be reported under the importer activity. Likewise, if you're importing unbranded goods, that would go under there. If you're importing essentially any unbranded packaging that goes on to be supplied into the UK market, that would be your responsibility. So for example, if you were importing goods on behalf of a UK brand owner and you're importing branded goods, then the UK brand owner on whose behalf you're doing that import, they would be responsible as the brand owner for the branded packaging. But you as the importer would be responsible for the import of the unbranded packaging. We now come to one of the more challenging activities, that of distributor. One of the reasons it's challenging is because the name really doesn't explain what it's talking about and causes quite a lot of confusion. So when we're talking about distributor, it's specifically talking about the supply of packaging to other companies. So not the supply of packaged goods, just the supply of packaging itself. So where you supply packaging to a small company, i.e. a company that has less than £2 million turnover or handles less than 50 tons of packaging, if you've imported that packaging to supply to them or manufactured that packaging to supply to them, then you would be defined as a distributor. And since that company that you're supplying to is too small to register under EPR to report their data, you as the distributor, the one supplying them the packaging, is responsible for reporting it. Specifically because of poor writing in the regulations, in 2023, you're only obligated as a distributor for packaging you manufacture or import. Was always intended that the distributor obligation would cover all packaging supplied by large companies to small companies. However, because the language doesn't allow for that understanding, that's not the way it's applied in 2023. It's intended once the full statutory instrument comes out that will be corrected. So at any point under that version, when a large company supplies new empty packaging to a smaller company, that large company would be responsible for reporting that they'd supplied packaging to that unobligated business, and they would carry the obligation costs for that. That obviously is not going to be the case this year. It's just limited to imported packaging and packaging you've manufactured. Hopefully that will be fixed in the future, because it has created quite a cavernous gap in the obligation matrix, if you like, for EPR. Some of to the smaller packaging activities, so it doesn't affect so many businesses. Service provider, so that's hiring or loaning out packaging. So typically CHEP would be a prime example of a service provider where they lease or they're loaning out their packaging on a commercial basis. And then the online marketplace operator. So you might be thinking, well, we have a website, so therefore we could be an online marketplace. This is, I would almost guarantee, no. The online marketplace is specifically designed for Amazon, Etsy, eBay, those kind of businesses, where they're providing a platform to allow non-UK businesses to supply into the UK. So that it's very unlikely that it will affect you. And seller. So the seller activity, this has been redefined just within the last fortnight. So this activity just relates to nation data. So what it's asking is, of the packaging you've supplied directly to consumers, so individuals not acting as a business, just an individual like you or me, where you've supplied that packaging to them, they're going to discard that. Where you're doing that, you're required to report where in the UK that's been supplied to. So in which home nation was that packaging supplied? So that doesn't affect many businesses. It tends to be really retailers who that affects, and it excludes a large number of businesses from having to report under the seller activity. So obligation types and requirements. So large producers, as we've said, and small producers have different responsibilities. So large producers will in the future have to carry the local authority waste management costs. The recycling obligation, which is covered through the purchase of PRNs, the certificates demonstrating that packaging material has been recycled, again limited to large producers only. Small producers will have reporting or data recording and reporting responsibilities, specifically in relation to nation data as well. The presentation will be made available to you afterwards, so you may want to look at this in a little more detail when you have time. But essentially, it just shows that if you are carrying out one of the at least one of those packaging activities as a large producer, you will carry the financing responsibilities of EPR. You will also have nation data reporting requirements if you are supplying packaging to end users. As a small producer, however, you do not have financing responsibilities. You are required to record the packaging that you're handling to demonstrate you are a small producer, not a large producer, and also that you carry your nation data reporting if you're supplying packaging to end users, specifically to consumers. So as I said, large producers have a number of responsibilities, some of which have been delayed due to the delay in implementation in EPR. So you're required to record data about the empty packaging and packaging goods that you've supplied, as we discussed under the different activities. Different from the packaging waste regulations, EPR data is reported twice annually. Because of the failure to fully implement EPR, that means if you are obligated as a large producer, you have to report under EPR twice a year and under the packaging waste regulations once a year. So your workload is tripled, so that's fun. There's also a requirement to, on a one-time basis, enroll on the government's report packaging data website. We say that July 2023, it was actually delayed until 2 days ago. So as you can see, that's all going swimmingly. So the Defra require enrollment just on a one-time basis. Now that creates a unique organizational ID, and that ID then identifies your company going forward in relation to EPR. If you're obligated and you're one of our members, then we're looking to get your data from you and submit it to us anytime from July through to the end of August. And then the intention was that the financing of EPR would begin from 2024, which, as I said, has been delayed. Large producers will also in the future need to pay the local authority waste management fees. One of the common questions is, how much is that going to be? We don't know, because until the scheme administrator is appointed, there's no sense whatsoever of the scope of that. All we know is that it has been generally talked about as being significant, because the local authority waste management fee is intended to pay for curbside collection for every local authority throughout the UK. So on that basis, we would assume that the cost there would be significant. And then also, as a responsibility for large producers, have nation data reporting. Nation data reporting is asynchronous with everything else. So it is the reporting for how much packaging you supplied to individual consumers in 2023 is not reportable until around, I believe it's September, October. So around September, October 2024. So it's on quite a different cycle to everything else. Small producers, which if you're obligated is more likely to be perhaps where you might be, feel like you might sit. So again, you're looking at recording data about empty packaging. You may be required to submit packaging data annually from 2024. I say maybe because the obligations for small producers have not been set in stone and may be subject to change. So there's some discussion around what those responsibilities will actually be. Still required to undertake that one-time enrollment, but that's delayed until January 2024. Then submitting your data to us from January onwards, and then paying the regulator the small producer fee in 2024. Again, that's probably delayed because it's not actually accounted for in the statutory instrument that was submitted, or that was passed, and we're still waiting for the full statutory instrument on that. And again, one of the main responsibility of the small producer will be to produce your nation data. So if you have supplied packaging to individual consumers in a sort of that retail sense, how much packaging was supplied, by material, and in which home nation was it discarded. So yeah, as we said, the nation reporting, it applies rather to both large and small producers. It's information about which country in the UK your packaging has been sold, hired, loaned, gifted, or discarded in, but it's only packaging that has been supplied to consumers. So of the packaging that you've supplied to your customers, how much of that was supplied directly to UK consumers, and in which home nation, UK home nation, were those UK consumers located? So it's a multi-point question. It has been, I think it's fair to say, one of the more challenging aspects of EPR for producers, even large producers, to come to grips with, simply because they've never previously been required to connect their packaging supplied out to the location in which it was discarded. So it has, I think it's reasonable to say that has presented with some challenges. I think generally speaking, what we would say is, if you do have that responsibility, and you carry out that activity where you're retailing goods to consumers, and therefore you are a seller in that sense, it's worthwhile looking at, right, what is the volume of that packaging by material? So paper, plastic, being the two typical types of material. And then look at, how do we ascertain location? So typically what we would say is, at the very least, if you're able to, by sales volume, ascertain, well, we've sold 20% of our goods to Scotland, 60% to England, etc., then you could apply the same percentages to the packaging that you've supplied out to consumers, and that would give you a reasonable assessment of that data. Just briefly looking at the registration requirements for EPR. There is, as I said, the original enrollment, that one-time enrollment process. That's not your registration. So if you are obligated to register under EPR, your first activity, particularly if you're a large producer, is to enroll and to acquire your unique organization ID. That just simply sets you up as identifies you as a company that may be reporting under EPR. Registration is quite different. So you can register once you're submitting data as an individual company. You can alternatively, if you are in a group, you can register as a whole group. So then the holding company has its own registration, and then each subsidiary is registered along with it. It's worth noting, though, that under the packaging waste regulations, whereas you could submit just aggregated data for the entire group, under EPR, you're required to report packaging data for each obligated business. So you might be in a group with 20 companies, but only 5 of them actually handle packaging. It's only the 5 who handle packaging who would have to register. But there'd have to be separate data for each of those subsidiaries that handle packaging. Alternatively, wherein some groups don't really function as a group of companies, they often potentially just work as separate businesses that happen to be in a group, then individual subsidiaries can register. It's worth noting, though, that the obligation arises because of either you are on your own over the threshold of £2 million or 50 tons of packaging handled, or in aggregate as a group. If you are over the threshold in aggregate as a group, the fact that you in your own subsidiary only handles 1 ton of packaging and you have a very small turnover, because the group in aggregate is over the threshold, you as an individual subsidiary would still have to register. So either you register as part of the whole group, or you register on your own as a subsidiary. But the fact that you on your own are below the threshold is irrelevant if, as a group, you're over the thresholds. And also, it may be that a group doesn't register with all the subsidiaries that are obligated under it. So, for example, again, where you've got a holding company and then 5 subsidiaries, perhaps the holding company registers 4 of those subsidiaries, and the other subsidiary registers separately on its own. In any event, all obligated businesses do have to register, whether they're registering as part of the group or on their own. If they exceed the thresholds, they do need to register. In terms of costs, the costs are not excessive, although they have increased for EPR. These costs won't apply yet, but will in the future. So for costs, you're looking at around £2,000 as a large producer, and then £500 for each subsidiary. For a small producer, it's about £1,000. Those fees being paid to the Environment Agency. Yeah, so enrollment on the government portal, as I said, this is essentially the information you need here, broadly speaking, is the sort of information that you'd find on Companies House. It is supposed to be completed by an approved person, and within the meaning of the regulations, that means either the sole trader, if it's a standalone or a sole business, a partner, if it's a partnership, or for most companies where you're talking about a limited company or a PLC, you're talking about a director or company secretary completing it. The approved person can authorize another person to verify and submit the information, and then that is now live, so that's from the 16th of August. So if you do need to go online and enroll, if you look for the report packaging data, you should find that on the government website. We'll just quickly look at the timeline. The timeline has been adjusted due to various difficulties and delays that have been experienced by Defra. So as I said, enrollment as a producer under EPR has been pushed back to the 16th of August, and the local authority waste management fee won't be implemented until at least 2024. There've been other delays associated with the whole system, but I think it's worth just having that as a general overview that you're looking at for period 1, because I said it's twice annual reporting. So period 1 reporting, you're looking at getting data completed by really the end of August at the latest for submission. For period 2, you're looking at end of February for submission there. Taking into account that if you are obligated, you'll also be submitting packaging waste data, so that will also need to be factored into sort of timelines and so on. That being likewise usually reportable by end of February. The local authority waste management fee, that's been delayed a full year, so financing of the packaging waste system during 2024 will follow the old method, so will be funded just through the PRN system and will not use the waste management fee. So it's worth mentioning, if you're not familiar with them, that the PRN is packaging recovery note. So it is essentially a certificate that proves that a given tonnage of packaging in a given material has been recycled. It's the means by which the government gets companies that handle packaging to put money into the recycling industry. So if you have handled a certain amount of packaging, say in paper and plastic, then you're obligated to fund the purchase of paper and plastic PRNs, and that creates a investment in the UK recycling industry. In terms of future considerations, as we said, modulated fees will come in due course. Those modulated fees will mean that if you are an obligated business and you're using packaging that's hard to recycle, then you'll be paying more than if you use packaging that is easier to recycle. Even if you're not an obligated business and therefore you're not part of the system, I think it's fair to say that where we see increased costs, increased compliance costs, ultimately those costs get passed up and down the supply chain, and so would affect you. The EPR system is part of, or was intended to be part of, a comprehensive suite of regulatory changes. Those are things like standard curbside collection. So I live in the Northeast, and my council picks up different materials to the next door council, which picks up different materials to the next door council, which will be different from your council, no doubt. Because of that, the lack of consistency, it makes the EPR system effectively impossible to run. So one of the changes they want to make is to have consistent collections. So that's one of the changes that will need to come into place. Also things like mandatory labeling, a deposit return scheme, which will cover England and Wales and Northern Ireland. As you may have heard, the Scottish system was delayed, so the idea is to have them all come online at the same time in theory. Again, that's planned for 2025. Another part of the puzzle that is this whole suite of regulation is the mandatory cup take-back system. So where your sellers of pre-filled single-use fiber-based cups, so your typical coffee cup from a high street chain coffee company, will be required to provide a bin in store to enable take back of these cups. It was said to be from 2024, but again, that's likely to be delayed. And frankly, all of this will probably depend on number one, when is the full statutory instrument published? When is any ancillary legislation associated with this published? When is it planned to come into force, and when is the next election is probably going to factor into this as well. It was planned to have a full EPR system review from 26 to 27 during that period. There's been a couple of audits of the legislation to date. One said it was impossible to get it to be operational until 2025, and the other said it wouldn't run until 2027. So as you can see, there's likely to be some delays, some stuttering and shuffling to do with implementation, but that is the outline of the plan to have that full suite of regulations in place, all associated and linked to extended producer responsibility. That's obviously a very quick overview of that. No doubt there'll be some questions, one hopes. And with that in mind, we'll go on to our Q&A.
Thanks, Andrew. That was comprehensive. Yeah, and yes, there are questions for you. So we've got about quarter of an hour to go, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. Like I say, if we can't get them before 10 o'clock, I'm sure we can follow up from this webinar. And then send on to the first one for you then is, and for those of us who've been collecting data and packaging for some years, whether it's packaging waste or whatever, are we looking at a complete overhaul, or generally will the data we're capturing in the minute just need slightly tweaking?
So the data that you're reporting will probably be reported, it may look very different, but the actual source data is probably the same. So for example, for those of you who are familiar, and apologies if you're not, because you probably switch over this point, but if you've previously reported under the packaging waste regulations, the fact that you imported and discarded packaging, so that would be reportable under table 3B, you're going to be reporting that as under the importer activity for EPR. But instead of just reporting it on a single line, you may have to break it up as between whether it's secondary or tertiary packaging. So the source data is exactly the same, but you're, as it were, sort of slicing that cake into different sizes than you were before.
Same source, different fields.
Exactly. Yeah.
Basically. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And then second question is, how are the PRNs and costs calculated based on the data submitted?
So at the moment for EPR, we don't know how the costs will be calculated. We believe that what will happen is that you will essentially, however many, I was going to say tons, but EPR reporting is in kilograms, just to make life more interesting. If the EPR reporting is in kilos, then it's simply how many kilos multiplied by whatever recycling target the government sets for a given material. So let's say for paper, it's 85%, and you've reported 100 kilos, then you're going to be responsible for 85 kilos, and that will then be converted into, right, so that's, you know, a fraction of a PRN that you'll be obligated to fund. We can't say that for certain because the actual calculation method to work out how you turn packaging handled into an obligation is not in the reporting SI that's been reporting statutory instrument that's been passed. It's supposed to be in the full statutory instrument. So until that's released, we can't be absolutely certain. But the way it's currently calculated, broadly speaking, is you take, for the packaging waste regulations, it's how much packaging did you handle multiplied by the recycling target set by the government. And then because packaging waste splits the responsibility for an item across the packaging chain, you also multiply by a further percent. So if you're the packer filler, it's 37%, say. So you're multiplying by 2 percentages. Because of the principle of single point of compliance, we believe all they're doing is taking out that last percentage and just saying, how much did you handle, multiplied by the target.
Makes sense. And I guess the sort of relative complexity of that is the reason why it's delayed. That the actual paying for all this has been delayed. It's reporting.
Yeah, and the unfortunately, the rush to get it out has meant that there's been confusion about terminology, definition. They produced the guidance before they produced the legislation, which meant that the two had contradictory elements in it. Defra have had webinars and meetings where they've said, we mean X, and then the Environment Agency has said that's all very well, but you've actually written Y, so we're gonna apply it as Y, not X. So there's been quite a lot of error, confusion, misunderstandings, delayed. We are still waiting for about, I'm going to say, around a dozen clarifications on definitions, explanations of things, which we've had no response because they're a bit busy right now. So, this even things like the reporting system, they've said, like, you have to report by this point, right? But you're going to tell us how to do the actual reporting. We still don't know how the data has to be submitted because they haven't told us. So even, it's a very disconnected, chaotic system at the moment. I think it's probably gives it too much credence to call it a system. It's a sort of random blocks of things thrown in the air at the moment, but we're trying to make sense of it as best we can so that customers can make progress. Otherwise, everything grinds to a halt.
Maybe there'll be future Andrew McHale webinars like this as things go on. It sounds that way. And here's an example that someone's given us. If products purchased from an EU supplier sent directly to an EU customer, not entering the UK, do they need to be included?
So this is UK legislation, and it specifically is just about packaging handled in the UK. So under the packaging waste regulations, you do have to report anything that is imported and exported, or otherwise is from the UK and exported. Under EPR, they forgot to account for exports, so they've just said leave them out. Any packaging which is in the UK and then exported is excluded. In that specific example, if the packaging never touches the UK, ignore it completely. It's not part of these regulations. And it's worth noting also that we're talking about UK regulations, so that excludes the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands as well.
Okay, so that's a no.
Yeah, leave it out. Leave it out.
Leave it out. Yeah. Okay, so are we obligated for our brand packaging placed on the market by a third party making the products under license?
So it literally depends on whether it's happening on your behalf or not. So if you've licensed someone else to manufacture on your behalf before you, then it's your brand, then it's your responsibility. On the other hand, if you have you license other companies to use your brand in other ways. So for example, I was talking to a company that licenses a tool brand from a tool manufacturer, but they put it on clothing, then and it's nothing to do with the tool company, they just have licensed someone else to use that brand, then it's you have a license to use that brand, it's your responsibility as that license holder.
Okay, that makes sense. The next one I think was sort of types as you were speaking. So it says when twice a year, which I think means do we report this? Is it twice a year reporting? I think that's
Yes.
So
yeah, EPR reporting twice a year. So that it's based on 2 periods. So period 1 is January to June. In this case, 2023, and the second period 2, is July to December. The reporting, obviously, it doesn't happen right at the end of that period because they've graciously given you a little time to calculate your data after that. So it's the reporting period covered is January to June, but the reporting has to be done by the end of August, beginning of September. Likewise, for period 2, covering July to December, reporting has to be done by around the end of February.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that, and on this end at post packaging as well, customers asking for packaging where it's January to June. So if you're a current customer of ours on here, that's very readily available. Very happy to do it for you. Next question was, how do we get the login to the government website? Is there a link? Guess we can.
Yes, we can certainly provide you with that link. I'll give the guys at Plus Packaging that it's not a secret or anything, but I will give you that. It's like I'm supplying a state secret. I'll hand that over, so that means that you can supply that out as part of your comms as well, so they can just share it if that's needed.
Hand it over, Andrew. Hand it over. We shall dispense it at will. Next question is, how will this be audited by the government?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Let's deal with the level of enforcement first. So I would say that the Environment Agency have said that they're going to take a pragmatic approach to enforcement, which I think, given that a lot of companies are unaware of the packaging waste regulations and they've been around for a quarter of a century, I think their attitude is, we're probably going to deal with a lot of businesses that have no idea about anything to do with EPR whatsoever. So given the chaos that's happened, I think what they're saying is, if you are aware of it and you're obligated, do your best to comply. So make diligent effort to comply. If you make a mistake, don't worry too much about it. I mean, certainly the packaging waste regulations, honest mistakes are fine. They have always taken an approach of, we'd rather you endeavor to comply. If there's a mistake, fix it. And it's what they do not tolerate is efforts to avoid compliance. So where they see businesses that have, especially where they've deliberately avoided registering when they know fine well they need to, they take a very dim view of that. But if you do your best to comply and make a right dog's breakfast out of it, that's fine. What they will say is just fix it, or when it's minor errors, they'll say just leave it and fix it next year. So I would assuming a similar kind of approach with EPR, particularly given the low level of awareness of it. I think they'll just be pleased with diligent efforts to sort of do your best. I've never met an Environment Agency auditor in the context of a packaging audit who's tried to screw anyone over. They see you're trying to do your best, even when maybe your level of understanding isn't perfect, and I haven't quite done that right. That, I have to say, have always been more of a partnership where, look, here's how you can get it right. Do so you've got 28 days to fix it, always, but use that 20 days, get it right, let us know you fixed it, move on.
Yeah, it's good. And then I suppose for your own brand and for the companies on here, by definition, you're on this webinar, you're obviously taking responsibility for it within the wording. It's good for your brand, isn't it, to get it, if you do manage to get a grip on it and know what to do, and that you can claim, not even claim, you're actually doing that and taking full responsibility.
Exactly.
That's going to give our own customers credibility and belief, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you may be sitting there thinking, oh, I think maybe we should have been obligated, or we should have been reporting under the packaging waste regulations for, I don't know how long. Believe me, that happens a lot. I've personally dealt with a number of pretty well-known brands who you think they haven't been reporting. How did they not know about it? A lot of companies are unaware, as I say, even of the packaging waste regulations. So if you do suspect that maybe you should have been registered in the past and you just haven't been, don't panic. It's still worthwhile addressing that. There is actually a formal mechanism to address that and to cover your unmet costs. And that's something that we can help you with. So if you do need to discuss that, again, that's another reason, just contact me. We can discuss what your liabilities might be and how to address that if that's necessary.
I think it kind of leads us on to the next question is, can the people who manage your waste reports, and for Plus Packaging, that would be yourselves at Wastepack, and report for us, or does it have to be the company themselves?
So you don't have to, I don't know where to phrase this. You don't have to have all of the information in your control, but you're supposed to. So that's one of the questions that the Environment Agency auditors always ask about, is like, how are you managing your own data as part of your responsibility? So whoever provides you with support, they should do so in a way that you still have control over that information, so that on request you can say, yeah, this is how much this weighs. Now, a lot of companies will rely upon companies like Plus Packaging and say, can you tell us how much a box weighs? And that's fine. You're absolutely allowed to do that. But what I would always say is, make sure you are still obligated to maintain those records. So you still have, if you're obligated as a company that handles packaging, when Plus Packaging provides you with that information, you need to maintain that data. You need to have that accessible when you're audited. So do look after it and make sure it's properly archived and so on, so that when someone asks, how have you worked out this figure, you can go back through your data and say, yeah, this is how we've calculated that from data provided for us. I would also say, though, if you do get information, if your packaging suppliers are kind enough to give you that information, it's good to record that yourself and use that as part of your internal data system, so that should, for whatever reason, you be unable to contact someone to give you that data, you do have it maintained internally.
That's good. And this particular packaging company will be kind enough to provide that data, I'm assure you. I'm going to do one more. I think we're nearing time, like that slightly past. So it's a good question, though. Let's get it in. So last one. There are more questions after this, and so we'll talk after this, Andrew, and get those sorted. But this question is: it's my understanding that the PRM process will sustain an EPR is in addition. However, this seems to contradict some of the articles that I've seen suggesting that PRNs are being replaced by EPR with a 1-year overlap. Is that true?
Yeah. So the original intention of EPR, or part of it, was to radically overhaul the PRN system, for reasons where they wanted it to be more predictable. They wanted it to be less subject to market shocks. There was a move to make the PRN system less just a floating commodity, but more, well, just apart from anything else, you can predict the price. That was one of the main issues. Over time, that's become less of a priority. I do not know why, but it's certainly not a priority within the EPR system. So the EPR then evolved to be essentially two financing elements. One, the PRN paying for the recycling of packaging, which is what it's for, or has been, and then the local authority waste management fee paying for the curbside collection. So that would be like that circle. That's how that would join up. So the bin wagon, the staff, the high vis jackets, the skips, the household waste recovery site, all of that will be paid for by the local authority waste management fee. And then once the packaging was taken away, taken to be reprocessed, that would be paid for by the PRN. So that's how that's now evolved. So because the financing element of EPR has been delayed, there is no local authority waste management fee, and the PRN is not being calculated based on EPR data. And because the full statutory instrument is not being introduced, the packaging waste regulations have not been repealed. Therefore, your obligation for PRNs is calculated based on the packaging waste regulations method, not on the EPR method. So there's a somewhat truth in what you've gathered. There was intended to be an overlap at one point, and there is an overlap of the regulations, but in terms of the financing, the PRNs will persist as far as we can tell into the future. There's been no clear indication of the PRNs themselves being withdrawn, because they do actually serve the function of funding the recycling of the packaging itself.
Perfect. Okay, we better wrap up, and I suppose that answer takes us to a point where the end. We know that we need to report. We know how we need to register. We know if we're obligated or if we're not obligated. We can send the PowerPoint right afterwards so that people can go back over that information. Sounds like there will be more webinars, because there's still a lot, sounds to me, like the actual funding of all this and how the money works isn't quite there. So looking forward to those. And that was comprehensive, Andrew. Thank you very, very much. And from a plus packaging point of view, as we said at the start, and compliance for us is expected. We would do that. And reporting is another level we want to take it to, where it's accurate and it's fast. And then we've spoken in some of those questions about what kind of detail you might need from us if you're a customer on here or a potential customer. And we want to take it to the next level and facilitate, which is the whole point of doing a webinar like this. If you want to speak to Andrew direct, that's absolutely fine. If you've got any questions at all, speak to us here at Plus or to Andrew, and we'll do everything we possibly can to help. Thank you very much.